Well, welcome back, my fellow learners. This is CSS class number 3 in the Learn CSS Once and For All series. This is all about CSS boxes, a critically important topic. This topic sets you on your path of creating layouts and understanding how objects relate to one another. What we will cover in this class is all of the following: block, inline, and inline-block boxes, the inner and outer display types, padding, margins, and borders, the CSS Box Model with its 2 different varieties, the standard type and the alternate type. We will use the Chrome development tools to inspect our box models to be able to tell us what sizes we have things set to. We'll also learn how to center images and modify the body tags. We'll finish up with some things to be aware of related to this topic. Well, let's go. So why do you care about CSS boxes to begin with? Here's a statement of fact. Everything in CSS has a box around it, whether you see it or not. Understanding the CSS box model enables you to create layouts, align items to each other, and build even more complex layouts. CSS has technically 2 types of boxes, the block box and the inline box. So let's make sure we're very clear on what the differences are and give some examples of each. The block box fills up 100% of its container's width, right? So just about every box will sit in a container. So it's going to fill up whatever that width is to 100%. The box will break onto a new line. If it's a block box, it'll break onto a new line. Padding, margin, and border settings will cause other elements to move away from the box. Width and height properties are permissible. They will apply. Examples of elements that use block as their outer display type by default include things like headings, H1 through H6, and paragraphs. Now, inline box attributes. The box will not break onto a new line, so they set up like railroad cars from left to right. Padding, margin, border settings will not cause other inline elements to move away from the box in question, and width and height properties will not apply. Examples of inline elements would be the anchor tag, span, emphasis, and strong. The type of box applied to an element is defined by the display property. Okay, and here we present the differences between the inline and the block boxes. On the top, we have the block boxes, and you can see the code on the right-hand side. The HTML document is on the top, and the CSS document is the lower right-hand corner. And then for inline, we have it on the bottom. So you notice the difference in the HTML code is we use paragraph tags for the block boxes, and we use span tags for the inline boxes. And of course, we know that inherently, paragraph tags are one that are by default block, and span tag by default are inline. I wanted to point out as well, for the CSS code on the bottom, I actually have 3 different rule sets for each of the boxes that you see, the 3 blocks and the 3 inlines. So 6 different rule sets. I'm only showing 2 here in the lower right hand corner to be brief. So again, very easy to tell. Block kind of follow each other and wrap around and break to the next line as they do here, and inline are kind of like railroad cars that go across. I'd like to underscore the difference between the inner and outer display type. CSS boxes have both of them. It's the outer display type that determines whether the box is either block or inline. The inner display type dictates how elements inside the box are laid out. The block and inline layouts are the default way that they work, and sometimes this is referred to as normal flow. However, we can change the inner display type by using display values such as flex. So we're going to get to flexbox and grid and all those types of things for layouts in later classes, but I wanted to make mention of it here in case you came across this to really understand the difference of what's making these things either block or inline. So we did mention with the block box that padding and boarding were permissible. They take them into effect. So we wanted to stop here and give the definition of padding, border, and margin, because sometimes these get confused and people might use them interchangeably. So what are they? So I have a handy dandy little diagram here. So the text is our content. Then in between the content and our border, which is the thick black line, that would be padding, the amount of padding, so we can increase or decrease that. And then from the border to the outside box is what is the margin. And again, we could, if it's a block element anyway, we could modify that as well. So that's the difference. If you follow the different arrows, the different color arrows, they'll take you exactly to what each of these properties are. So let's jump deeper into the padding property and see how we would actually code this up in our CSS code. So we have this notion of the padding area. The padding area is on all four sides of an element, and it's really short for padding top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. You can set all these individually if you choose, but it's the space between the content and its border, like we said on the previous page. So now I have the font in red here to indicate exactly where each of these are. And it happens as you would set a clock. Sometimes you'll be wanting to do this. It's like, oh, which one is which? It goes from top to right to bottom to left. Okay, so if you look at our example here, this is the full-fledged example. You're going to see all of these varieties in your experience. But I have 5 pixels set for the top, for the right, for the bottom, and for the left. Sometimes you'll see just one number. If I had padding colon 5 pixels, 5 pixels would be applied to everything. So it would have an even border, just like this. It would be tantamount to what you see here, right, using the 4 different numbers. Sometimes you'll see just 2 values. If you see 2 values, the very first value will pertain to the top and bottom border setting, and then that second value will pertain left to right. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. Sometimes you'll see 3 values. Well, if there are 3 values, the first applies to the top, the second to the left to right, and the third is the bottom. So don't let it fool you. And of course, if you see 4, then it's 1 for each, right? Just like I have in our example here. I won't spend as much time on the margin property page because just about everything I said for padding applies to margin in terms of how it works and if you have 1 value or 2 or 3, etc. The difference here, of course, is the placement of the red texts. So the margin top is not in between our content and the border. It's beyond the border, right? It's between the border and the parent container. So that's the difference there. The other difference is the top and bottom margins have no effect on inline elements such as span or anchor or anything like that. And you can set it to auto. The browser selects a suitable margin to use if you do that. You can also set to negative numbers, which will draw the element closer to its neighbor than it would be by default. So you can tighten it up even more by using negative numbers. Play with it and see. The very best advice I can give is to play with it all and see what looks good to your eye and make sure you're clear on how it works. So all that we've been talking about with margins and padding and border really is to lead us up to the CSS box model. Now we can formally define it and look at the 2 different types. So the model defines how the different parts of a box, the margin, the border, the padding, and most importantly, the content work together to create a box that you can see on the page. The full CSS box model applies to block boxes. Inline boxes only use part of the behavior. There are 2 different types, and there is the standard and the alternate box model. And the layers are just what we've been talking about, the content, which is where our lettering would go, the padding, the border, and the margin. So you may wonder, what's the difference then between the standard and the alternate box model? Very simply, one is going to be larger than the other. The standard will be larger than the alternate. Why? Here's why. The total size taken up by the box for the standard model includes both the padding and the border. For the alternate model, it doesn't. So by default, browsers use the standard box model. If you want to turn on the alternate model for an element, you do it by setting the box sizing property. So you set box sizing to border box. And I give you the example down here. And written in this particular way with the pseudo selector after it, this is if you want all your elements to use the alternate box model. That might be something you choose to do as part of your style for that particular part of your website. You can do the before and after setting here for box sizing to inherent. All right, so let's look at this in action. I have both the standard and the alternate box model. So let's look at the HTML code in the upper left-hand corner. I have a class of box for the standard box model, and then I have 2 classes of box and alternate for the alternate box model. For box, I set my border, my background, my padding, my margin, my width, and my height. And again, that's the standard, the default version. And then for alternate, I use the .alternate class and set box sizing to border box, and you see the difference. And we mentioned it on the previous slide that the alternate box model will always be smaller in size because it doesn't include the padding and border in its total size taken up. And then why is it then that my alternate has the same properties of the standard box? It has the same box color, it has the same border color, it has the same border width. Why is that? Well, we haven't seen this before, but we're applying two classes to alternate, both box and alternate, right, to that box on the bottom. So it takes everything that box has and just adds to it the alternate rule set. So that second div that has the text the alternate box model gets both the box rule set applied to it and the alternate rule set applied to it. Make sense? And we also want to make sure we're using Chrome DevTools to inspect the size of our boxes. So we've said this before in a previous class, but if you go into Chrome, right-click on the home page, select Inspect, and from in that web page, you can start within the Elements tab, and you can simply drag your mouse across any part of your code in this section here, and you'll be able to see the difference between the box that is standard and the box that is alternative. You can also do some more stuff. If you go over to the Styles tab that I show you right here, you're able to actually see all the different sizes of the boxes. Again, you'll have to hover on the actual statement in your HTML code to the left, and then you'll be able to see all the sizes of your border, your margin, your padding, your actual content itself. So you can do all that stuff and really inspect some of this, not only for your own stuff, but also as a learning aid for somebody else's website. So we mentioned before there's the inline element and the block element. Did you know there's also an inline block? So what is that? This provides a middle ground between inline and block. You can use this when you don't want an item to break onto a new line, like inline, but you do want to use the width and height properties to avoid overlapping, like block. An element with display inline block does a subset of block things. You can use the width and height. Padding, margin, and border will cause other elements to be pushed away from the box. However, it doesn't break to a new line, and it will only become larger than its content if you explicitly add width and height properties to it. Let's see it in action. So this is a terrific use case here where we have a span inside of a paragraph. With our default inline for the span element, you see what happens here. In our particular case, we have this overlap, looks really nasty. But if we change it to display inline block, as it's shown here down on the bottom, now I'm able to add margin and padding, height and width, and all of a sudden it becomes very pleasing. Mission accomplished. So something that you'll have called to do quite frequently is center an image, right? Seems very basic. We know that images by default are inline, which means that they ignore margins and padding when applied. So we must give it a block behavior to apply the margin, which we did with display block right here at number 2. We also use auto for the second value of our margin. This is a special value that divides the available horizontal space evenly between the left and right. So with those two changes, we are instantly able to have a wonderful output that looks just like this. I also wanted to point out how I modified the body tags here. So you see this full blue section would be the parent container or the base container or my HTML tag. And you see that that is indicated through this blue color that I have set right here in the background for that element. I set the width of the body to 600 pixels, and I set the margin, I use that same trick, margin auto on that second value, which sets horizontal left to right. So it really just gives not that these colors are so pleasing because I have all this other junk going on, but it really gives a nice pleasing kind of middle ground for the eye to focus on. We mentioned before, if I had block elements, they take up 100% of the width of their container. And of course, the 100% of the width in this case is only 600 pixels wide because its parent container is the body and it sits within that. So there's lots that we can do to modify our layout and make things look pleasing to our eyes and those of our customers. Before we end, there are some other gotchas that I want you to be aware of. Browsers apply some default styling to things like heading tags, like H1 elements, even when you haven't applied any CSS. To compensate for this, we can set margin to 0. Also be aware of what's known as margin collapsing. If you have two elements whose margins touch, those margins will combine to become one margin, which is the size of the largest individual margin, whether it's element 1 or element 2. So if you're creating space with margins and you don't get the results that you expect, it could be that you're dealing with this phenomenon of margin collapsing. So be aware of that. And here I give you some of the same links that I've provided for some of the earlier CSS classes. I hope you find them helpful, especially the first one, which is one that I rely on all the time, which is the MDN Web Docs for CSS. Okay, coding family, thank you for watching till the end. If this class has helped you, consider helping me to continue to bring these classes to you and others. Helping is easy. Just do the following. First, subscribe to the Yogi Coder YouTube channel, and all you have to do is click on my little icon here on the lower right-hand side, and it'll bring up the subscription button right away. Next, you can leave whatever comments or questions you'd like. And finally, share this video on any and all social media channels with your friends and your colleagues. Thank you again for watching, and until we meet again, happy coding.